Hello everyone. The previous videos were about the Monte Carlo engine and the strategy intelligence report. There we looked more at structural robustness, strategy quality, stress behavior, and whether a system actually deserves trust. But now it's time for a much deeper tool, the EA breakdown and drawdown survival simulation. And here I wanted to do something different. Instead of building one giant page with random stats everywhere, I built this tool in steps. So every step brings you closer to the truth about the account, the portfolio structure, and especially the robots inside it. You slowly break the portfolio apart, analyze what is actually helping the account survive, what is creating hidden pressure, which robots deserve trust, which robots are dangerous, and what the portfolio looks like after cleanup and survival reruns. So instead of only showing surface-level performance, this workflow tries to expose the real structural behavior behind the account. The workflow starts with the statement upload. Just like the previous tools, the system first reads the MT4 or MT5 statement and verifies whether the data was parsed correctly. At this stage, the goal is simply to confirm what was detected inside the account before the deeper analysis begins. So the tool checks things like the platform, the number of parsed trades, the robots that were detected, the symbols, the starting balance, and whether the statement structure is clean enough for the later workflow steps. I am not going too deep into this section because this is mainly the audit layer before the actual breakdown starts. Once the statement is verified correctly, the workflow moves into the real EA breakdown process. Now we move into step 2. And this is where the real part of the tool starts. The statement is parsed, the data is checked, and now the tool begins to break down the portfolio by robot. For this walkthrough, I'm again using my own live account statement. I already know this account and I already know what kind of result this report is going to show. And that is actually important because what you will see can look very strict at first. Some robots may not receive a clean keep immediately, and that can look like the tool is saying the robots are bad. But that is not the right way to read this. These are mostly breakout robots. Breakout systems can be profitable for a long time, but still create heavy waiting periods, drawdown pressure, volatility, or survival pressure inside a full portfolio. So this tool is not only asking, did this robot make money? It is asking something stricter. Does this robot deserve clean capital trust inside this full portfolio structure right now? That is a much harder question. So when a robot is not immediately classified as a clean keep, it does not automatically mean the robot is useless or bad. It means the tool wants more caution, more context, or a deeper look before trusting it with capital inside the full account. And that is exactly why I built this workflow in steps. Because the first verdict is not the full story. The deeper tables, the contributor layers, the cleanup logic, and the survival simulation together show what is really happening inside the portfolio. Now we move into the actual EA breakdown layer. This is where the tool starts scanning the portfolio robot by robot and transforms the raw trade history into robot-level diagnostics. At the top, you first get the explanation of what this layer reads. It checks which robots are keep, watch, or kill candidates. It also checks if robots carry real edge, if they are fragile, if they depend too much on a few strong trades, and if they are structurally weak before the survival part even starts. And below that, you immediately get the first portfolio scan. In this example, the tool found 38 robots. Only one robot is classified as keep. 9 robots are placed in watch, 28 robots are placed under kill pressure, and the average health score is only 21.89. So the first portfolio survival red is marked as dangerous. But this is important to understand correctly. This does not mean you should blindly delete everything. It means the first structural scan is very strict and sees a lot of pressure inside the full robot basket. The tool is not only asking if a robot made money, it is asking which robots create the most structural pressure inside the portfolio. So from this point, the goal is not to panic. The goal is to go deeper into the next tables and understand why the tool is giving this kind of pressure. Now we move into the outlier dependency layer. And this is honestly one of the most important parts of the entire workflow. Because a robot can look profitable on the surface, while most of the actual profit only comes from a few extreme winner trades. So what this layer does is very simple. It starts removing the best trades from every robot one by one. First the best trade, then the best 3 trades, then the best 5 trades. And after every removal, the tool recalculates the remaining net profit. So now we are no longer asking, was the robot profitable? We are asking, does the robot still survive after removing the strongest winners? And this is where things can become very dangerous very quickly. You can already see the first structural read. The average outlier risk inside the portfolio is 57.87. 10 robots fall into severe dependency, 6 robots into high dependency, 16 into medium dependency, and only 6 robots remain in the low-risk category. So already here, the tool is telling us that a large part of the portfolio depends heavily on a small number of trades. Now we move into the actual outlier dependency table, and this is where the workflow becomes much more forensic. The table starts with the robot identity itself. So first you see the symbol and magic number, the decision bucket, the health score, the outlier dependency score, the outlier risk, and finally the structural verdict. So already here, before even looking at the profit breakdown, the tool is already classifying which robots show dangerous dependency behavior. And you can immediately see that a large part of the portfolio falls into severe outlier dependency pressure. Then when we scroll further into the same table, the tool starts showing the actual structural breakdown behind those verdicts. Now we can see the original net profit, the net profit without the best trade, the net profit without the best 3 trades, and the net profit without the best 5 trades. And this is where some robots completely collapse structurally. Some robots still survive after removing strong winners. But other robots go from profitable to deeply negative very quickly once those top trades disappear. Then when we scroll even further to the right, the table starts exposing the actual dependency percentages behind the collapse. Now we see top 1 dependency percentage, top 3 dependency percentage, top 5 dependency percentage, and finally the total trade count behind the robot. And this is where the tool exposes how concentrated the profitability really is. Some robots show dependency percentages exploding far above 100%, which means the profitability is almost entirely dependent on only a few outlier trades. So this entire layer is really trying to answer one question: is the robot structurally profitable? Or does the profitability mostly come from a very small number of extreme winners? Now we move into the full outlier reason detail layer. And this part pushes the dependency analysis even deeper. The table starts with the structural identity and classification of every robot. So first we see the symbol and magic number, the outlier dependency score, the outlier risk, the outlier verdict, and finally the exact structural reason generated by the tool. And this is important because now the workflow is no longer only giving scores. Now it starts explaining why the robot received that classification. Some robots are flagged because one single trade carries most of the profitability. Others are flagged because the sample size is too small, or because a few trades create too much structural dependency inside the result. And at the top here, you can clearly see that a large part of the portfolio falls into severe dependency pressure. But when we continue further down the table, the picture also becomes more balanced. Now we start seeing medium dependency classifications, visible dependency warnings, and eventually even low dependency structures with healthier profit distribution. So this layer is not simply trying to destroy every robot. It is trying to separate fragile profitability from healthier profitability distribution. Then when we scroll further into the same table, the workflow exposes the actual trade contribution structure behind every verdict. Now we can see the best 1 trade profit, the best 3 trades profit, the best 5 trades profit, the original net profit, and the remaining profitability after removing the strongest winners. And this becomes very visual very quickly, because some robots still survive structurally after removing the strongest trades. But other robots almost completely collapse once only a few outlier winners disappear from the history. Then further to the right, the final part of the table continues with the net profit without the best 3 trades, and the net profit without the best 5 trades. So at this point, the workflow is really stress testing how distributed the profitability actually is inside every robot structure. And honestly, this is something you almost never see in normal retail EA analysis, because most reports stop at net profit, profit factor, or equity curve. But this layer is trying to answer a much harder question. How much of the profitability still survives once the strongest outlier trades are removed? Now we move into the robot trust matrix layer, and this is where the workflow starts translating the robots into actual institutional trust structure. Because up until now, the tool has been stress testing profitability, dependency, fragility, and structural pressure. But now the question becomes, does this robot actually deserve capital trust? So this layer starts evaluating things like sample integrity, edge quality, risk control, recovery structure, psychology pressure, and overall consistency inside the robot behavior. And this is important, because a robot can still look profitable while the underlying trust quality remains weak. So the workflow is no longer asking, can this robot make money? It is asking, would I realistically trust this structure with serious capital exposure? Then below that, the first trust classification appears. In this example, the average trust score of the portfolio is only 38.11. No robots are classified as fully ready. 6 robots fall into the small capital category, and 30 robots are classified as not ready. So again, the workflow remains extremely strict. But this is also intentional, because this layer is not designed to flatter the portfolio. It is designed to pressure test whether the robot structure is actually mature enough for cleaner deployment quality. And honestly, this is also why I built the trust matrix separately from the normal health score, because a robot can still survive some layers while failing deeper trust validation. Once psychology pressure, recovery quality, or dependency structure are added into the equation, now we move into the actual robot trust matrix table. And this is where the workflow starts combining all the previous structural layers together into one institutional trust profile per robot. So the table starts with the symbol and magic number, the decision bucket, the health score, the trust verdict, the sample integrity, the edge quality, and the risk control structure. And already here, you can immediately see that the portfolio is not completely one-sided. Some robots still maintain strong structural readings across multiple trust pillars. You can see combinations like good trust verdicts, strong edge quality, good risk control, healthy sample integrity, and relatively strong health scores. So this layer is not only exposing weakness, it is also trying to identify where actual structural quality still exists inside the basket. At the same time, other robots begin weakening once the workflow evaluates the deeper trust structure behind the profitability. So now the workflow is separating surface performance from actual deployment trust quality. Then when we continue scrolling further into the same table, the workflow starts evaluating deeper pressure and resilience layers behind every robot. Now we see recovery quality, psychology pressure, outlier resilience, capital readiness, and the outlier dependency score. And this is where the trust matrix becomes much more realistic from a deployment perspective, because now the workflow is no longer only asking, does the robot survive statistically? Now it asks, can this robot realistically survive pressure, drawdown, recovery cycles, dependency stress, and real execution psychology over time? And again, this layer is not completely negative either. Some robots still maintain strong recovery structure, good outlier resilience, lower dependency pressure, and small capital readiness classifications, while other robots fail deeper trust validation and fall into demo or observe or not ready structures. Then when we continue scrolling further to the right, the final part of the table starts exposing the actual structural metrics behind those trust classifications. Now we see top 3 dependency percentage, net profit without the best trade, net profit without the best 3 trades, total net profit, profit factor, return over drawdown, maximum drawdown percentage, underwater days, and finally the total trade count. And honestly, this is where the workflow becomes extremely deep, because now the tool is combining profitability, dependency structure, drawdown behavior, recovery quality, psychology pressure, and trade durability, all into one institutional-style trust evaluation layer. So at this point, the workflow is no longer behaving like a normal EA report. It behaves much more like a structural capital allocation filter for the full robot basket. Now we move into the full trust reason detail layer. And this section is important because the workflow is no longer only showing the trust classifications themselves. Now it starts explaining the actual structural reasoning behind every trust verdict inside the matrix. So the table begins with the symbol and magic number, the trust score, the trust verdict, the capital readiness classification, the trust reason, and the sample reason structure. And immediately here, the workflow starts separating different levels of statistical maturity across the robots. Because now we begin seeing classifications like usable sample, minimum sample reached, low sample, very low sample, good trade sample, and deep trade sample, combined with short active period, decent active period, or long active period. And this becomes important because the workflow is no longer only evaluating profitability. Now it is evaluating how much structural evidence the robot actually has behind its behavior. So some robots show usable samples with long active periods, good trade samples, deep trade samples, and broader historical durability, while others still remain stuck in low sample structures, very low sample structures, or short active periods, where the workflow recognizes that the statistical proof is still too fragile for stronger institutional trust. Then after the sample reasoning layer, the workflow continues deeper into the actual structural explanation layers behind the trust profile itself. And this is where the matrix starts explaining why certain robots received stronger or weaker institutional trust classifications. So first, the workflow moves into the edge reasoning layer and the risk reasoning layer. Now we start seeing explanations tied to net profitability, profit factor quality, SQN strength, expectancy structure, win rate pressure, drawdown pressure, and loss streak behavior. And this becomes extremely important because the workflow is no longer looking only at final profit. Now it is evaluating how stable the edge actually looks internally and whether the risk structure behind the returns remains realistically survivable. So some robots still show positive net profit, very strong profit factors, positive expectancy, healthy edge structure, and acceptable drawdown pressure. While others immediately start revealing weak SQN, borderline profit factors, negative expectancy, high drawdown pressure, visible underwater pressure, or psychologically dangerous loss streak structures. Then when we continue further into the same reasoning layer, the workflow starts evaluating recovery behavior and execution psychology much more deeply. Now we see recovery reasoning, psychology reasoning, underwater duration pressure, profit speed, recovery efficiency, and psychological sustainability during drawdown periods. And this layer becomes very realistic from a live deployment perspective, because many robots can survive mathematically while still becoming psychologically untradeable during real execution. So here the workflow starts separating robots that recover efficiently from robots that technically survive but become structurally exhausting to hold through live drawdown cycles. Some robots show excellent return versus drawdown behavior, healthy recovery quality, strong recovery structure, controlled underwater duration, and psychologically lighter execution profiles. While weaker structures begin showing poor recovery quality, negative profit speed, extreme underwater duration, heavy psychological pressure, unstable recovery behavior, and loss streak structures that require very high execution discipline. And finally, the workflow moves into the capital reasoning layer itself. This is where the framework translates all previous structural layers into actual deployment readiness logic. So now we start seeing explanations tied to controlled sizing, forward testing requirements, observation status, capital restriction logic, on whether the robot realistically deserves scaling. Some robots are still classified as usable, but only with controlled sizing until more proof appears. Others move into demo. Observe structures where the framework recognizes partial strength, but still sees structural weaknesses that require further validation before scaling decisions become realistic. And the weakest profiles become full not ready structures, where the workflow detects severe outlier dependency, poor recovery behavior, psychological instability, weak trust pillars, or structurally dangerous capital conditions. So at this point, the framework is no longer behaving like a normal EA report. It is behaving much more like a real institutional allocation review system, where profitability alone is no longer enough, and long-term structural durability becomes the main requirement for trust. Now we move into the portfolio concentration layer. And this layer is extremely important because the workflow is no longer evaluating individual robots separately. Now it starts evaluating whether the full portfolio itself is structurally diversified, or whether the entire account becomes dangerously dependent on a small number of robots, symbols, or concentrated profit sources. So the layer starts by analyzing the concentration risk, the concentration score, the top 1 robot share, the top 3 robot share, and the dominant symbol activity concentration. And immediately, the workflow starts exposing something very important. Because a portfolio can still look profitable on the surface, while internally being carried almost entirely by one symbol, one robot, or one small cluster of trades. So now the framework begins asking, is the basket truly diversified? Or is most of the portfolio depending on a narrow structural core that creates hidden fragility? And in this example, the workflow immediately detects high concentration pressure. We can see a high concentration risk classification, a very large top 1 robot share, an even heavier top 3 robot dependency, and an overwhelming dominant symbol concentration around XAUSD activity. So even though the portfolio may still generate profit, the workflow recognizes that the account structure itself is becoming too centralized. And this is extremely important from a real capital allocation perspective, because concentration risk can become dangerous very quickly once market conditions shift, one strategy weakens, or one dominant symbol enters a different volatility regime. Then the workflow continues deeper into the portfolio concentration read itself. Now it starts translating those concentration metrics into actual structural portfolio interpretation. So instead of only showing percentages, the framework explains whether the account behaves like a balanced portfolio or a structurally dependent portfolio. And here, the workflow clearly identifies that the account has high dependency on specific robots, specific symbols, or concentrated trade groups, meaning the system may still produce good historical performance, while remaining fragile underneath due to concentration imbalance. Then the layer continues even further into the deeper structural pressure metrics behind the concentration profile. Now we see dominant symbol share, manual net profit impact, and worst damage concentration from the weakest robots. And this becomes extremely useful because the workflow is now separating healthy diversification from concentrated exposure risk. So for example, a dominant symbol share above normal levels immediately tells us that one instrument is controlling most of the account behavior. The manual net profit impact helps detect whether discretionary intervention materially affects portfolio structure. And the worst damage share evaluates whether a small group of weak robots creates most of the portfolio pain. So at this stage, the workflow is no longer acting like a normal EA basket overview. It is behaving much more like a real portfolio concentration audit, where the system evaluates whether the account structure itself is stable enough for long-term capital deployment. Then the workflow moves into the concentration reason summary layer. And this section acts like a structural interpretation block for the full portfolio concentration profile. So instead of only showing raw percentages, the framework now summarizes the actual dependency risks detected across the account. And immediately, the workflow starts highlighting several major concentration warnings. We can see the top 1 robot showing visible profit dominance, the top 3 robots creating clear concentration pressure, and XAUUSD heavily dominating overall account activity. And this becomes very important because the workflow is now identifying where the portfolio starts losing diversification quality internally. So even if the basket still produces strong historical profit, the framework recognizes that too much of the account behavior is being controlled by a very narrow structural core. Then the workflow pushes even deeper into the dominant symbol dependency itself. And here the system explicitly shows that XYSI carries an overwhelming share of total portfolio activity, meaning the account is no longer behaving like a broadly diversified multi-strategy basket. Instead, the portfolio becomes highly dependent on one dominant market environment, continuing to behave favorably. And the framework also detects another important structural issue: manual trading damage. So now the workflow is not only evaluating automated systems anymore. It is also measuring whether discretionary intervention is weakening overall portfolio quality. And in this example, the system clearly identifies that manual trades are actively damaging the account structure rather than strengthening it. Then below the summary layer, the workflow moves into the actual concentration breakdown table itself. And this table becomes extremely detailed. Now the framework starts mapping every robot into a concentration role inside the portfolio structure. So we now see the symbol and magic number, the concentration role, robot net profit, absolute profit contribution, profit share percentage, damage share percentage, decision bucket, health score, profit factor, return over drawdown, maximum drawdown percentage, underwater days, and total trade count. And this is where the workflow starts behaving much more like a real portfolio allocation desk. Because now the system is no longer only asking which robots make money. Now it asks which robots are carrying the portfolio, which robots are creating structural damage, and whether the portfolio remains balanced enough for realistic deployment. So some robots become classified as profit carriers, meaning they contribute meaningful positive performance to the account structure, while others become classified as damage sources, meaning they contribute disproportionately to portfolio instability, drawdown pressure, or negative structural impact. And this creates a much more realistic institutional portfolio view. Because in real allocation environments, capital is not only deployed towards strong performers. Weak structural contributors also need to be identified, controlled, reduced, or removed entirely. And when we combine profit contribution, damage share, health quality, drawdown structure, underwater duration, and concentration dominance, the workflow starts building a true structural map of the entire portfolio ecosystem itself. Now we move into the robot failure diagnosis layer. And this is where the workflow becomes much more aggressive from a structural risk perspective, because this layer is no longer trying to identify the strongest robots. Now the framework is specifically trying to diagnose why certain robots are weak dangerous, fragile, or structurally unfit for capital deployment. So the layer starts by evaluating primary and secondary failure types, failure severity, recommended cleanup action, and whether the weakness comes from drawdown pressure, weak edge quality, outlier dependency, sample instability, or portfolio damage concentration. And this is extremely important because many robots can still appear profitable on the surface, while the structural foundation underneath remains dangerously unstable. So now the workflow starts converting statistical weaknesses into actual operational failure categories. And immediately, the framework detects very heavy failure pressure across the basket. We can see an extremely high average failure score, a very large amount of robots classified under extreme failure severity, almost no structurally clean profiles, and a portfolio-wide warning that serious cleanup is required before meaningful capital allocation becomes realistic. And this changes the entire perspective of the workflow, because now the system is no longer asking, which robots made money? Now it asks, which robots are structurally dangerous even if they produced profit? And that is a very different type of analysis. Then the workflow moves into the robot failure diagnosis read itself. And this acts like a full structural health warning for the basket. The framework now evaluates whether the combined failure pressure across the account has reached dangerous levels. And in this example, the workflow clearly identifies that a large portion of the portfolio suffers from high or extreme failure pressure, meaning the portfolio may still contain profitable systems, but too many of them are structurally unstable underneath. So the framework recognizes that before scaling, before allocation, and before serious deployment, the basket first requires cleanup, risk reduction, and structural filtering. And this becomes one of the most realistic layers inside the entire workflow. Because in real portfolio environments, capital protection is not only about finding strong robots, it is also about aggressively identifying fragile structures, dangerous dependencies, hidden instability, and systems that can become future damage sources during changing market conditions. So at this point, the workflow behaves much more like a real institutional risk review process, where the objective is not only performance generation, but long-term survivability and structural portfolio durability. Now we move into the actual robot failure diagnosis layer table. And this is where the workflow starts exposing the real structural failure map behind the robot basket. Immediately, we can see that a large part of the portfolio is sitting inside the kill bucket with extreme failure severity. Many of these robots show health scores near 0, failure scores near 100, and structural classifications like critical health or kill bucket profiles. So at this stage, the workflow is no longer treating these robots as temporary weak performers. It is identifying them as structurally dangerous components inside the portfolio ecosystem. But at the same time, the table also starts separating different types of failure pressure. Because not every weak robot fails for the same reason. Some robots fail because of weak edge quality. Others fail because of psychology pressure, outlier dependency, streak instability, or unsafe profit concentration. And that distinction matters a lot. Because the workflow is not only trying to identify weak robots, it is trying to diagnose the exact structural reason behind the weakness itself. So now the framework starts building a much deeper map of the portfolio. Not simply which robots lose, but which robots create instability, which robots create psychological pressure, which robots create dependency risk, and which robots become dangerous under real capital conditions. At the same time, we also start seeing robots that survive outside the kill bucket. Some move into watch classifications, others into medium or low failure severity, while stronger structures begin keeping healthier balance between edge quality, drawdown structure, and survivability. So this layer becomes much more than a profitability ranking. It becomes a structural diagnosis system for the full robot ecosystem. I'm going to stop this part here, not because the workflow is finished, but because I just found out that the program I use to create these videos only allows videos up to 30 minutes. So I have to be honest about that and split the rest into another part. I don't want to pretend this was the plan from the beginning. The tool is just too deep to force everything into one video. So I'll stop here, and in the next part we continue properly.